January 1475. The Ottoman Empire stands at the height of its power. Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople, breaker of Byzantium, has turned his gaze northward. His objective is simple: crush the small principality of Moldavia and open the gates to Central Europe. He sends an army so vast it takes hours to pass through a single valley. 80,000 men. The largest Ottoman force ever deployed into Eastern Europe. Against them stands Stephen III of Moldavia, a prince with no illusions about his chances. He commands barely 20,000 soldiers. Most are militia, farmers with spears, villagers with bows. But Stephen is not a fool. He knows he cannot win by meeting this army head-on. So he doesn't try. Instead, he does something far more dangerous. He waits. He watches. And when the moment comes, he turns the land itself into a weapon. This is the story of the Battle of Vaslui. A battle fought not with numbers, but with patience. Not with steel alone, but with snow, fog, and frozen rivers. A battle where the terrain became the executioner, and where an empire learned that size does not guarantee survival. Before we go deeper, take a moment to subscribe and tap the like button. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing the world gather here. Let's go back. Back to a time when Moldavia was a frontier state, caught between the expanding Ottoman Empire to the south and the crumbling Kingdom of Hungary to the west. It was a land of forests, rivers, and cold winters. A land that bred tough men and even tougher rulers. Stephen III had taken the throne in 1457, and from the beginning, he understood one thing: Moldavia would only survive if it remained unpredictable. He played the great powers against each other. He paid tribute when necessary. He rebelled when possible. And he made sure that no foreign army ever felt comfortable on his soil. But by the mid-1470s, the balance had shifted. Mehmed II was no longer content with tribute. He wanted submission, total control. And when Stephen refused to bend the knee, the Sultan decided to make an example of him. The order went out: invade Moldavia. Destroy its armies. Capture or kill Stephen. Install a puppet prince. Make it clear to every Christian state in Europe that resistance was futile. The man chosen to lead this invasion was Hadim Suleiman Pasha, a veteran commander, a trusted general, and a eunuch who had risen through the ranks by sheer competence. He was given an army that reflected the empire's confidence. 80,000 men. Janissaries. Saipa cavalry, Anatolian infantry, Balkan auxiliaries, engineers, archers. The kind of force that could level cities. The kind of force that did not lose. Suleiman crossed into Moldavia in early January 1475. His army moved in columns that stretched for miles. Supply trains followed. Scouts ranged ahead. The plan was straightforward: march north, crush any resistance, and take the capital at Sasiva. Intelligence suggested that Stephen's forces were scattered, that he was unprepared, that he might even flee. They were wrong. Stephen had known this invasion was coming for months. He had spies in the Ottoman court. He had agents watching the border. And the moment he received confirmation, he began preparing. But not in the way most commanders would. He did not gather his entire army in one place. He did not fortify cities. Instead, he did something that seemed insane. He ordered a scorched earth retreat. Every village in the path of the Ottoman army was evacuated. Grain was burned. Wells were poisoned. Livestock was driven deep into the forests. Bridges were destroyed. Roads were blocked with fallen trees. The Ottomans would find nothing. No food. No water. No shelter. And with every mile they advanced, they would stretch their supply lines thinner. They would grow colder, hungrier, more frustrated. Stephen's plan was not to meet the enemy at the border. It was to let the land weaken them first. And it worked. As Suleiman's army moved north, they found only ruins. Empty villages. Frozen fields. The cold bit through their armor. The snow slowed their march. Morale began to drop. Soldiers grumbled. Officers grew anxious. But Suleiman pressed on. He had his orders. And he believed that once he found Stephen's army, the battle would be over quickly. Stephen, meanwhile, was gathering his forces. Not in one massive camp, but in scattered positions across the hills and forests surrounding the town of Vaslui. He knew the Ottomans would come this way. It was the logical route to Sasiva, and it was here, on ground of his choosing, that he would make his stand. But this would not be a traditional battle. Stephen had studied the terrain carefully. Vaslui sat in a landscape of rolling hills, dense forests, and narrow valleys. In winter, the rivers froze solid. The ground became treacherous. Visibility dropped when fog rolled in. And it rolled in often. Stephen saw opportunity in every detail. The forests could hide his troops. The hills could conceal his movements. The frozen rivers could be crossed in places the Ottomans didn't expect. And if he timed it right, if the fog came when he needed it, he could strike before the enemy even knew where he was. He began positioning his forces. Archers were placed on the high ground, hidden among the trees. Cavalry units were stationed in the forests on both flanks, ready to charge when the signal came. His main infantry force, small but disciplined, was positioned just beyond a narrow valley, where the Ottomans would have to pass. And then, Stephen did something brilliant. He made sure the Ottomans saw exactly what he wanted them to see. He sent out decoy units. Small groups of horsemen who appeared on the ridges, then disappeared. Just enough to make the Ottomans think they knew where the Moldavian army was. Just enough to lure them forward. Suleiman took the bait. His scouts reported that Stephen's forces were ahead, apparently preparing for a defensive stand. The numbers seemed manageable. The terrain, while difficult, was not impossible. Suleiman ordered his army to advance. January 10th. Dawn broke cold and grey. A thick fog had settled over the valleys during the night. Visibility dropped to less than 50 meters. The Ottoman army moved forward in columns, trying to maintain formation in the murk. Officers shouted orders. Drummers beat a steady rhythm. But the fog swallowed sound. It swallowed sight. Men could barely see the soldier next to them. Stephen watched from a hillside, hidden in the trees. His scouts had brought word. The Ottomans were entering the valley. They were spread out, disorganized, blinded by the fog. It was time. He gave the signal. From the hills, from the forests, from positions the Ottomans never saw, Stephen's forces struck. Arrows fell like rain. Not in volleys you could see coming, but suddenly, out of the white. Men screamed. Horses panicked. The Ottoman columns tried to form defensive lines, but they didn't know where the attack was coming from. The fog hid everything. Then came the cavalry. Moldavian horsemen charged from the flanks, smashing into the disoriented Ottoman infantry. They struck hard, then vanished back into the fog before the enemy could respond. It was chaos. Pure, brutal chaos. Suleiman tried to rally his men. He ordered the Janissaries forward, hoping their discipline would hold. But they were fighting blind. Every time they formed up, another attack came from a different direction. And then Stephen played his final card. He had positioned units on the far side of a frozen river. The Ottomans didn't know it was there, didn't know it could be crossed. But Stephen's men knew every inch of this land. They crossed the ice and hit the Ottoman rear. Now the enemy was surrounded, trapped in a valley with no clear way out. The fog that had seemed like an inconvenience became a death sentence. The Ottomans broke. Not all at once, but in pieces. Units tried to retreat, only to collide with other units trying to advance. Panic spread. Discipline collapsed. Men threw down their weapons and ran. But there was nowhere to go. The forests were full of Moldavian soldiers. The hills were death traps. And the frozen rivers, which some tried to cross in desperation, cracked under the weight of armored men. The slaughter lasted hours. By the time the fog lifted, the valley was a graveyard. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers lay dead. Thousands more were captured. The survivors fled south in scattered, broken groups. Suleiman himself barely escaped. His grand army, the pride of the empire, had been destroyed. Stephen did not pursue. He didn't need to. He had achieved something far more valuable than a pile of corpses. He had shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility. News of the disaster reached Mehmed II within days. The Sultan, who had expected a quick victory, was stunned. 80,000 men. Gone. An entire army, obliterated by a prince with a fraction of the numbers. The loss was not just military. It was political. It was psychological. Christian Europe, which had been cowering in fear of Ottoman expansion, suddenly saw hope. Stephen became a hero overnight. Popes praised him. Kings sent envoys. He was called Athleta Christi, the champion of Christ. Coins were minted with his image. Songs were sung in his honor. For a brief, shining moment, Moldavia was the most famous state in Europe. But Stephen was not a man who believed in moments. He knew this victory had bought him time, not safety. Mehmed would return. The empire did not forgive humiliation. And he was right. Within a year, Mehmed himself led another invasion. This time, the Sultan took no chances. He brought an even larger army. He moved more carefully. He didn't underestimate Stephen again. The two forces clashed at the fortress of Niemt. This time, Stephen could not repeat his miracle. He was forced to retreat into the mountains. Moldavia was ravaged. But it was not conquered. Mehmed's army, exhausted and overstretched, eventually withdrew. The Sultan had made his point. Stephen had made his. The war ended in an uneasy stalemate. Moldavia remained independent. Stephen remained on his throne. And the Ottomans learned a lesson they would not forget. Some enemies cannot be broken by size alone. But to understand why valor mattered, we need to zoom out. We need to see the bigger picture. Because this battle was not just about one kingdom. It was about the survival of Christian Europe. By 1475, the Ottoman Empire had become the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Constantinople had fallen in 1453. The Byzantine Empire was gone. The Balkans were under Ottoman control. Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, all conquered or vassalized. Hungary was under constant pressure. Venice was losing its trade routes. The Pope was sending desperate pleas for a crusade, but no one was answering. And then came Vaslui, a battle that proved the Ottomans could be beaten. Not by massive crusader armies, not by papal coalitions, but by smart, ruthless, determined leadership. By using terrain. By refusing to fight on the enemy's terms. Stephen's victory did not stop the Ottoman advance. It did not reverse the empire's conquests. But it did something equally important. It bought time. Time for Hungary to fortify its borders. Time for Poland to strengthen its defenses. Time for the Italian states to build alliances. And most importantly, it planted a seed of doubt in the minds of Ottoman commanders. The empire was not invincible. Small states could resist. And if they fought smart, they could win. That doubt mattered. It influenced Ottoman strategy for decades. It made future invasions more cautious. It gave Christian Europe breathing room. And in the long, grinding struggle between the Ottoman Empire and the West, breathing room was everything. But let's return to the battle itself. Because the genius of Vaslui was not just in the tactics. It was in the psychology. Stephen understood something that many commanders miss. War is not just about killing the enemy. It's about breaking their will. It's about making them doubt themselves. And that's exactly what he did. The Ottomans came into Moldavia expecting an easy campaign. They were veterans. They had conquered cities. They had crushed armies. But they had never fought an enemy like Stephen. An enemy who refused to meet them head-on. An enemy who turned the land into a trap. An enemy who used the weather, the terrain, the fog itself as weapons. When the ambush came, it shattered their confidence. They were the conquerors of Constantinople. They were the terror of the Balkans. And they were being slaughtered by farmers and villagers in a frozen valley. It didn't make sense. It wasn't supposed to happen. And that confusion, that disbelief, made the panic worse. This is the hidden power of asymmetric warfare. It's not about having more soldiers. It's about making the enemy fight your battle, not theirs. Stephen forced the Ottomans to fight in conditions where their numbers were useless. Where their discipline didn't matter. Where their experience became a liability. Because nothing in their experience had prepared them for this. And the fog. The fog was everything. Without it, the ambush might have failed. The Ottomans would have seen the Moldavian positions. They would have formed up properly. They would have used their superior numbers to grind through Stephen's defenses. But the fog took away their vision. It turned a disciplined army into a mob. It made every shadow a threat, every sound a danger. Stephen didn't create the fog, but he waited for it. He planned for it. And when it came, he used it with surgical precision. This is the mark of a great commander. Not someone who wins by brute force, but someone who understands timing, who reads the terrain, who knows when to strike and when to wait. Stephen was outnumbered 4-1. By every logical measure, he should have lost. But logic doesn't account for terrain. It doesn't account for weather. And it doesn't account for a commander who refuses to play by the rules. The aftermath of Vaslui was brutal. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers froze to death trying to retreat. Thousands more were hunted down by local villagers, eager to take revenge for years of raids. The survivors who made it back to Ottoman territory brought tales of horror, of an army swallowed by fog, of invisible enemies, of frozen rivers that cracked beneath their feet. These stories spread, and they changed the way people thought about the Ottomans. For years, the empire had seemed unstoppable, a force of nature, but Vaslui proved they were human. They could be outmaneuvered. They could be beaten. And that realization rippled across Europe. Stephen understood this. He didn't just want to win a battle. He wanted to send a message. To Murmd. To Europe. To history. The message was clear: Moldavia would not kneel. And neither would he. In the years that followed, Stephen fought dozens more battles. He won. Most of them. He lost some. But he never stopped fighting. He ruled Moldavia for 47 years, longer than almost any medieval ruler. And when he died in 1504, he left behind a legacy that few could match. But Vaslui remained his greatest triumph. Not because it was his bloodiest victory, not because it was his most decisive, but because it was the moment when he proved that intelligence could beat power, that preparation could beat size, that a small nation, led by a brilliant mind, could stand against an empire. And the battle itself? It entered legend. Chroniclers wrote about it. Poets sang of it. And for generations, Moldavian children grew up hearing the story of the day their prince turned winter into a weapon. But let's dig deeper into the mechanics. How did Stephen actually pull this off? Because ambushes sound simple on paper, but in reality, they require flawless execution. One mistake, and the whole plan collapses. First, intelligence. Stephen's spy network was exceptional. He knew the size of the Ottoman army. He knew their route. He knew their supply situation. He even knew the names of their commanders. This intelligence allowed him to plan with precision. He didn't guess where the Ottomans would go. He knew. Second, terrain mastery. Stephen had spent years studying the land around Vaslui. He knew every hill, every forest, every river. He knew where the ground was firm and where it turned to mud. He knew which valleys funneled movement and which ones opened up. This knowledge gave him an enormous advantage. The Ottomans were marching through foreign territory. Stephen was fighting at home. Third, discipline. His troops were outnumbered, but they were not disorganized. Stephen drilled his men relentlessly. He made sure they knew their roles. Archers knew where to position. Cavalry knew when to charge. Infantry knew how to hold. And everyone knew the signal to attack. This discipline held even in the chaos of battle, and it made all the difference. Fourth, deception. Stephen didn't just hide his forces. He actively misled the Ottomans. He used decoy units to make them think his army was in one place, when it was actually in another. He let them see what he wanted them to see. And when they committed to their advance, it was already too late. Fifth, timing. Stephen waited for the perfect moment. He didn't attack when the Ottomans first entered Moldavia. He didn't attack when they were still organized and cautious. He waited until they were deep in enemy territory. Until they were cold, hungry, and frustrated. Until the fog rolled in. And then, when every factor aligned, he struck. This is not luck. This is mastery. And it's worth noting that Stephen didn't just rely on the ambush. He had contingency plans. If the fog hadn't come, he would have used the forests differently. If the Ottomans had detected his positions early, he had fallback routes prepared. He was not gambling. He was stacking the deck. This level of preparation is rare. Most commanders hope for the best. Stephen planned for the worst and prepared for everything in between. Now, let's talk about the Ottoman perspective. Because they were not fools. Suleiman Pasha was an experienced general. His officers were veterans. His soldiers were professionals. So why did they fall into the trap? Overconfidence. That's the simple answer. The Ottomans had spent decades winning. They had crushed larger, better equipped armies. They had conquered fortified cities. They had broken the Byzantine Empire. And now they were marching into a backwater principality with a massive numerical advantage. They expected Stephen to either flee or die. This overconfidence made them careless. They didn't scout as thoroughly as they should have. They didn't take the scorched earth strategy seriously. They assumed Stephen was panicking, not planning. And when they entered the valley near Vaslui, they were thinking about the next objective, not the current danger. The fog made it worse. It disrupted their formations. It blinded their scouts. It turned their size into a liability, because large armies need space to maneuver. In the fog, packed into a narrow valley, they were just a target. And once the ambush began, there was no recovering. Panic is contagious. Once a few units broke, others followed. The Janissaries tried to hold, but they were isolated, surrounded, cut off. The cavalry tried to charge, but they couldn't see where they were going. The infantry tried to retreat, but the rear was already under attack. It was a perfect storm. And Suleiman, to his credit, tried to rally his men. But there are moments in battle when control is simply lost. When the chaos is too great. When fear overrides training. Vaslui was one of those moments. The retreat was a nightmare. Ottoman soldiers fled in every direction. Some tried to fight their way south. Some hid in the forests. Some tried to cross rivers and drowned when the ice broke. Moldavian forces pursued them for days, picking off stragglers. Local villagers joined in, eager for revenge. The Ottoman army, which had marched into Moldavia as a unified force, left as scattered, broken remnants. Suleiman escaped, but his reputation was destroyed. He was recalled to the capital and quietly sidelined. Murmed, furious at the loss, blamed him publicly. It was a humiliation the general never recovered from. But the real loser was not Suleiman. It was the Ottoman strategy. For years, the empire had relied on overwhelming force, on the assumption that larger armies always won. Vaslui shattered that assumption. It forced Ottoman planners to rethink their approach. Future invasions became more cautious, more methodical, less arrogant. And Stephen, he became a legend. Not just in Moldavia, but across Europe. His victory was celebrated in Rome, in Vienna, in Krakow. He received letters from kings and popes. He was offered alliances, gold, soldiers. For a brief moment, he was the most famous man in Christendom. But Stephen was not interested in fame. He was interested in survival. And he knew that Vaslui, as glorious as it was, had only made Murmed angrier. The Sultan would return. And next time, he would not underestimate Moldavia. Stephen prepared for that return. He rebuilt his fortresses. He trained more troops. He strengthened his alliances. And when Murmed did invade again, Stephen was ready. The Second War was longer, bloodier, and more destructive. But Moldavia survived. Because Stephen had bought it time. And in the brutal calculus of medieval warfare, time was everything. Let's zoom out one more time. Because Vaslui's importance goes beyond tactics. It touches on something deeper. Something about the nature of power. The Ottoman Empire in 1475 was a superpower. It had wealth, manpower, technology, and momentum. It could field armies that dwarfed anything its enemies could muster. It had conquered lands stretching from the Balkans to Anatolia to the edges of Persia. By every measure, it should have crushed Moldavia without effort. But power is not just about size. It's about adaptability. And empires, especially successful ones, often become rigid. They develop a playbook, and they stick to it. The Ottomans had a playbook: invade, overwhelm, conquer. It worked in the Balkans. It worked in Anatolia. It worked in Greece. So they assumed it would work in Moldavia. Stephen understood this. He knew he couldn't beat the Ottomans by copying their methods. So he didn't try. He invented new methods. He turned his weaknesses into strengths. His small army became mobile, flexible, and unpredictable. His lack of resources forced him to use the terrain creatively. His defensive position allowed him to choose the battlefield. This is the power of asymmetry. The strong assume the weak will fight conventionally. But the weak, if they're smart, refuse. They change the rules. They fight in ways the strong are not prepared for. And sometimes, that's enough. Vaslui was not a fluke. It was the result of years of preparation, brilliant strategy, and flawless execution. It was a masterclass in how to fight when you're outnumbered. And it remains one of history's great examples of a smaller force defeating a larger one through intelligence, terrain, and timing. But it's also a reminder that history is full of surprises. The inevitable is never truly inevitable. The unstoppable can be stopped. And the outcome of a battle is never determined by numbers alone. Stephen's victory echoed through the centuries. It inspired future commanders. It became a case study in military academies. It was referenced by strategists, historians, and leaders. Because Vaslui proved something timeless: that courage, intelligence, and preparation can overcome almost any disadvantage. And the fog, the frozen rivers, the ambush in the valley, those became the stuff of legend. Stories told around fires, poems recited in courts, paintings hung in castles. Vaslui was not just a battle. It was a symbol of resistance, of defiance, of the refusal to surrender. For Moldavia, it was a defining moment, a moment that shaped the nation's identity for generations. Stephen became a national hero, remembered not just for his victories, but for his refusal to bow. And Vaslui became a sacred name, a battle that proved a small nation could stand against an empire. For the Ottomans, it was a wound. Not just a military defeat, but a psychological one. It forced them to confront their own vulnerabilities. It reminded them that expansion had limits. That not every enemy could be crushed. That even the mightiest empires could stumble. For Europe, it was a beacon. A reminder that the Ottoman advance was not inevitable. That resistance was possible. That faith, strategy, and courage could still matter in a world dominated by empires. Vaslui gave hope to kingdoms that had been losing hope. It inspired future battles. It changed the calculus of war. And for us, looking back across more than 5 centuries, Vaslui is a story. A story about a winter morning when fog rolled into a valley. When 20,000 men faced 80,000. When a prince with no illusions about his chances decided to fight anyway. And when, against all odds, he won. It's a story about the power of terrain, the importance of intelligence, the value of patience, the danger of overconfidence, and the timeless truth that in war, as in life, the biggest force does not always win. Stephen III of Moldavia ruled for nearly 5 decades. He fought more than 40 battles. He won most of them. But Vaslui was the one that made him immortal. Because it was the battle where everything came together. Where every element of his genius was on display. Where history pivoted, just for a moment, on the edge of a frozen river. The Ottoman soldiers who survived Vaslui carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives. They told their children about the fog. About the arrows that came from nowhere. About the valley that became a tomb. And those children told their children. And so the story spread, passed down through generations. A cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating an enemy. Stephen died in 1504, at the age of 70. He had outlived Mehmed II by 23 years. He had outlived most of his contemporaries. And he had ensured that Moldavia, that small, stubborn principality on the edge of Europe, would survive long after he was gone. His tomb became a shrine. His name became a rallying cry. And his victory at Vaslui became a legend. Because in the end, Vaslui was more than a battle. It was proof Proof that size does not guarantee victory. Proof that intelligence and preparation can overcome overwhelming odds. Proof that a leader willing to think differently, to fight on their own terms, can achieve the impossible. It was a frozen morning in January. A valley filled with fog. A prince with 20,000 men. An empire with 80,000. And when the fog lifted, the empire was broken, and the prince was a legend. That's the power of Vaslui. That's the legacy of Stephen III. And that's why, more than 500 years later, we still remember the day winter became a weapon, and a small nation defied the world. The battle was over, but the story was just beginning. Because Vaslui didn't just change the map. It changed minds. It changed strategies. It changed the way commanders thought about warfare. And in the decades that followed, its lessons rippled outward, influencing conflicts far beyond Moldavia's borders. Other small states took notice. If Stephen could do it, maybe they could too. Polish commanders studied his tactics. Hungarian generals debated his strategy. Venetian diplomats referenced his victory in letters to the Pope. Vaslui became a symbol of what was possible when courage met cunning. But symbols are dangerous. They inspire, but they also deceive. Because Vaslui was not a formula. It was not something that could be copied and repeated. It was a product of unique circumstances, a unique commander, and a unique moment in time. Stephen won because he understood his enemy, his terrain, and his own limitations. He won because he didn't try to be someone else. He won because he fought his battle, not theirs. And that's the real lesson of Vaslui. Not that small armies can beat large ones, but that victory belongs to those who refuse to fight on the enemy's terms. To those who see the battlefield not as it is, but as it could be. To those who turn disadvantages into advantages and wait for the moment when everything aligns. Stephen waited for that moment. And when it came, he didn't hesitate. He struck with precision, with brutality, with absolute commitment. And in doing so, he carved his name into history. The fog has long since lifted from that valley. The rivers have thawed and frozen 1,000 times over. The soldiers who fought there have been dust for centuries. But the story remains. The story of a January morning when the impossible happened. When a prince with nothing but will and intelligence turned a frozen valley into a graveyard for an empire. Vaslui stands as a reminder that history is not written by the largest armies. It's written by the smartest commanders. The ones who see what others miss. The ones who refuse to accept defeat before the battle even begins. The ones who understand that war is not just about strength, but about vision. Stephen had that vision. And on January 10th, 1475, he used it to change the course of history. If this story moved you, if it made you see history differently, then stay with us. There are more battles to uncover. More heroes to remember. More moments when the world turned on the edge of a sword. And we'll be here, bringing them to you, one story at a time. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for keeping these stories alive.